is one step closer to ending the impasse. Word of the potential trial of the king is spreading out from London. Abingdon in Oxfordshire is a hotbed of Puritan groups and home to a commoner who now steps into the political limelight. A 26-year-old woman, the self-proclaimed prophet Elizabeth Poole, has had a vision, and she's arriving to share it with the General Council of Officers. Who was Elizabeth Poole?
Well, nobody. Poole was a woman who had at one time lived in Abingdon, where we are now, as part of a gathered church. This was a church that took place in the kind of room we're sitting in now.
So it was a very informal church.
Exactly. There was no leader. Instead, people would perhaps listen to a sermon from a lecturer, and then they would speak as the Spirit moved them. So they believed that every person could be possessed by the Holy Spirit, speak in the power of God.
So the gathered churches were more perhaps egalitarian than a traditional congregation?
Massively more egalitarian, because there wasn't even a vicar. So they really believed that they were overturning the hierarchy of experts in favour of God's chosen spokespeople. And they argued that you didn't have to have a degree from Oxford or Cambridge to speak in the power of the Spirit, that any person could. And that really opened the door to very unconventional people taking the lead in matters of religion. People like Elizabeth Poole.
How did she come into contact with Cromwell and his fellow leaders?
She approached the Army Council because she said she'd had a vision that was relevant to them.
That's quite a confident thing to do.
Yes, it was an extraordinary thing to do, but that was the kind of moment that it was historically. We're seeing a moment where very ordinary people are finding themselves capable of overthrowing hierarchy and saying what they believe God has told them to say.
And what were Elizabeth's words? What did she claim to have seen in her vision?
Well, this is where Elizabeth really played into their hands. She had a wonderfully sustaining vision of the country as a weak, crippled, feeble woman, and the army as a strong, burly young man protecting that weak and feeble woman.
How extremely flattering.
It was indeed. And so, of course, they listened to her really attentively and endorsed her. And Henry Ireton, an army grandee, said, "I see nothing in her but the fruits of the Holy Spirit."
So what happened after Elizabeth had delivered her vision to the council? What effect did it have?
Well, they were massively keen because she told them what they wanted to hear, that they were these strong, masculine figures and that the country needed them to protect it. It was also because they really wanted God to show them some sign that they were doing the right thing.
Elizabeth Poole seems to be confirming everything that Cromwell and his parliamentarian allies want to hear. But still, they hesitate at the enormity of this course of action. If they pass a law which allows them to put the king on trial for treason, they have to accept that the end result could mean the king's death. At the Bodleian Library in Oxford, there's a document that shows the agonised soul-searching that Charles's enemies are going through. The title of this paper is a deliberation about the execution of justice upon H.R. And the first thing that strikes me about it is how intimate it is. It's not official, it's not formally worded, it's very private. It's as though I'm being allowed to eavesdrop on a conversation that happened 400 years ago. References in the text date it fairly precisely to the Christmas period of 1648, and although we don't know who the author or authors are, it does seem that they were closely connected with the centre of power, with Parliament or with the Council. Effectively, it's a kind of rhetorical laundry list. It starts with the prose, that the execution of H.R. will stand with the justice of our cause. That is killing the king in line with what the parliamentarians fought for. At times, the document is quite accusatory, enumerating the supposed crimes of the king against his people, as here. Would to God it were otherwise, and that he knew what a stream the blood of 300,000 innocents would make. He would have thought something of a humour and of a hurrying revenge were to be quitted in himself, rather than by holding to either seek to make that rivulet a sea. Effectively, what they're saying here is that King Charles ought to want to die for shame at his crime against his own people.
And then the writer's doubts start.
So here we begin with the arguments against the execution of the king. The first of which is the state of the parliamentarian cause. It's not the case that they're all in unity. They're quarrelling amongst themselves, they're divided, no one knows what to do. There are many different interests at stake. And the authors summarise it thus: rocks have grown out of ourselves. It's a sort of horribly physical image of, yes, dispute appearing like cankers on the body politic. At the end of the list of arguments against Charles's execution, we find this: to have no kingly government at all, and then what everlasting inlets will there be left for torrents of mischiefs and machinations? It's a wonderfully theatrical phrase, torrents of mischiefs and machinations. And what they mean is, if you get rid of the king, then what kind of government what you might have? Could it be corrupt? Could it be dangerous? Could it be worse than kingship itself? And so the authors of the deliberation conclude, for these reasons, therefore, my vote is vivat rex. May the king live.
It's all too clear from this 17th century writer's meticulous rehearsal of the arguments about the king's future that at Christmas 1648 there is nothing inevitable about what will come next. As the month of December draws to an end, despite the ban on traditional Yuletide celebrations, some brave souls are determined to have fun. In London, 4 playhouses have reopened and are illegally putting on performances.
This is the site of the Salisbury Court Theatre, the last theatre to be built in London before the Puritans closed them all down in 1642. But even in the febrile atmosphere of London at Christmas 1648, the players at Salisbury Court believed the show should go on. They took the opportunity to improvise a satire on the current political situation, playing with the crown of one of the characters. This newspaper, the Kingdom's Weekly Intelligencer, offers an eyewitness account of what they did. In the way, they oftentimes took the crown from his head who acted the king, and in sport would oftentimes put it on again. The people, not expecting such a pageant, looked and laughed. But sadly for the actors at Salisbury Court, neither the laughter nor the play at a last.
Soldiers stormed the theatre and shut the whole thing down. Resistance is futile. A parliament controlled by the military is hard to defy. Trapped at Windsor, the king also has no power to act against his captors. For Charles, the best hope of salvation will either come from God or his family abroad.
Charles is very much a family man. He loves his family. The kind of aloof public persona is really quite at odds with the warm individual that he was. He adored his wife, Henrietta Maria, and she is in exile in Paris, trying desperately to get the French to help to put pressure on Parliament and the new model army.
Charles's older children, Charles, James and Mary, are in Holland. Mary's married to the Prince of Orange, and they're trying to agitate from the distance. And then there are 2 children in England. There's 13-year-old Elizabeth and there's 8-year-old Henry, and they are both prisoners of Parliament.
The 13-year-old Elizabeth,
who has been writing to him, and he has written her a very touching letter in which he says that he's sorry he hasn't been writing to her much, but when he's feeling miserable, he says he doesn't want to write to her and sort of pass on the misery, essentially, and asks her to give her little brother a kiss, the 8-year-old Henry.
As the new month opens, the Rump Parliament is sitting, and once again the subject of debate is the ordinance to try the king. Since its last reading, a committee has been adding details to it.
They're a committee of the House of Commons. They have been delegated the task of drafting effectively what will become largely the charge against the king and trying to give it some sort of statutory basis.
It's a daunting task. The committee faces two huge problems. There are serious doubts amongst the MPs about the very legality of trying the king. And beyond that, there's no court or procedure through which to do it.
They're struggling to find a structure for something completely new. They could have tried to put him in an ordinary court. The Court of King's Bench would be the court in which treason trials would normally have been held. But then, under the common law, then they would have to have a jury. And a jury, although they can be handpicked to a certain extent, are much less capable of being controlled. And their deliberations are not controlled. So even if you think you've got hot parliamentary men in the jury, that may not be the way it pans out.
The committee have come up with a solution. They'll create a temporary High Court which will sit for just a month with the sole purpose of trying the king. And instead of a jury, they'll appoint carefully vetted, what they call commissioners, who will act as judge and jury in one. This still doesn't get over the problem of the dubious legal basis for trying a king. How can you have Rex versus Rex?
The law of treason is really fashioned to protect the king, not put him on trial. And it was a real conundrum until a very brilliant lawyer solved it for Cromwell by charging tyranny, which in our modern term is like committing crimes against humanity, killing or civilians, torturing prisoners, that kind of behavior. And of course, fighting, essentially declaring war on the English people, which the king did. So that was the thinking, finally, that broke this conundrum. Yes, a king can commit treason if he makes war, kills his own civilian people.
Oliver Cromwell is amongst the MPs debating that day, and he's been named as commissioner. He's on the committee that's drafting the ordinance. But it's hard to find any evidence of exactly what he's doing, or more importantly, thinking at this time. There are no letters or documents detailing his thoughts or speeches.
The point is about Cromwell, he's always elusive. There is this very famous phrase that's attached to Cromwell, that he's practiced at not knowing. He's always slightly off stage. He's always someone who manages not to get his hands dirty when a major political operation is taking place.
It's a mistake made by a lot of historians to think somehow that Cromwell is doing everything and is planning the death of the king and the republic. That's not the case. Cromwell, he's in a state of wonderment. He's waiting on God. He's waiting for these divine signs.
Cromwell may well be waiting for a sign, but parliamentary process is rolling on. The majority of MPs in the Commons accept the committee's recommendations. The ordinance has passed another crucial stage, but it's still not law. To do this, it has to go to the Lords. The very next morning, the ordinance to try the king is sent up to the House of Lords. They are faced with the job of scrutinising this radical new legislation and, if they agree, taking it one step closer to making it law.
They asked the advice of the 3 judges who had been named as those who were to preside over the High Court of Justice, and all 3 judges said categorically that the whole thing was a legal farce.
The House of Lords at this stage is only really about a dozen peers, not royalists. They're kept away. So we're talking about parliamentarian lords. They're mainly sort of veteran campaigners, people like the Earl of Manchester, who commanded the Eastern Association in the First Civil War.
Despite being parliamentarians, helping to pass a law to actually put the king on trial and possibly to death is a step too far.
There was a good deal of nervousness. The Lord Chancellor had jumped in a carriage to get away. The Lord Chief Justice had gone to the country. People of high position were well aware of the Treason Act and that it was treason to depose a king, and they were extremely nervous. So the Lords were very reluctant to deal with that. They went to water.
The Lords vote against the ordinance and then declare that they're adjourning for a week. I think they hope that by the time they come back, the whole business will just have been dropped.
If the Lord's ploy works, it might halt the wheels of the bureaucratic machine. But if it doesn't, everything is moving towards the king's death. It's hard to know how much of this drama being played out in Westminster is known by Charles, 25 miles away in Windsor.
There is sort of a sense with Charles right now that he's sort of floating above it all, and he doesn't really seem to have comprehended the gravity of the situation. So sometimes, he might even be talking about planting melons in Wimbledon. And previously he was talking about sort of rebuilding of Whitehall. So there's this sense, I think, that he's just sort of biding in his time, and he's sure that God will protect him.
Much of what we know about Charles at this time comes from his servant Thomas Herbert's memoir. He gives little insight into the king's thoughts and feelings, but he does tell one story.
Thomas Herbert was Charles's gentleman of the bedchamber, and he tells in his account of Charles's time of Windsor of one episode where the diamond seal of Charles's timepiece was lost, and Charles instructed one of his servants to look for it, and the servant looked high and low and couldn't find it, and Charles was sort of disturbed and unsettled by this.
For Charles, denuded of the splendour of his kingly court, a loss like this assumed a huge importance.
Thomas Herbert searched everywhere for the king's seal without success. But in the next instalment of this gripping saga, he recalls that a little before His Majesty went to bed, a good charcoal fire being in the chamber and wax lights burning, the king cast his eye to one end of the room and saw something sparkle, and pointing with his finger bade Mr. Herbert to take a candle and see what it was. By good providence it was the diamond, which he took up and found His Majesty's arms in it, and with joy brought it to the king.
It's a sort of odd event to record, but I think it does show how, certainly as a symbol of Charles's kingly authority, the trappings of his ceremony, the splendour, the magnificence of his position gradually being lost, and he was left to kind of try and find the remnants of things like the diamond seal of his timepiece, but actually, of course, time was ticking, and really he knew that perhaps the end was coming, and certainly his kingly authority was ebbing away.